Hi, I'm Joe McNulty, author of the book A Sick Prejudice, Overcoming Our Primal Emotions and Stereotypes of Someone with a Serious Illness. Today I'm going to talk about a phenomenon that comes up and gets in the form of a couple of questions that people can have when they get a serious illness. This is when they are usually first starting to be diagnosed, when they have had it, through a few months or so. They can start to notice that some friends and family start to behave differently, that somehow the relationship changes in some ways. And they may even start to notice that some friends over some time anyway and family start to disappear. They can ask, where have all my friends gone eventually? And that's what I'm going to talk about today. It is a issue that's right at the heart of a sick prejudice. It affects a lot of people. It certainly did when I was sick. I would see people, friends and family, going through a kind of evolution or stages of how they dealt with my wife's illness and my own illness. And over time, some people just dropped off and were gone. Others stepped up and were, a real godsend. However, many people, though, struggle with this and how to relate to it and how to be involved in the situation. And that is so much of what the Sick Prejudice book is about. I'm just going to summarize here because it would be too lengthy to go into all that. I really suggest that you get the book, not as a ploy to sell books, but there is going to be so much more in the book than I can do in this video, and I think it really helps to set the foundation for how to deal with this issue of people changing and of the feelings that they can have. So first, illness, disease, serious injury trigger some very ancient responses in us. Going back a couple of million years into our evolution, into the Pleistocene epoch, we have some information that illness, disease, injury were all things that had some very substantial effects on our evolution due to the pain that was associated with them and the impact that they could have on our small family level hunter-gatherer types of groups that we lived in. There's a book called The Evolution of Sickness and Healing by Horatio Fabrega, and it talks about this at length and is one of the few books out there that does go into some of this evolution, depending on how you think about evolution. But then it was considered, a large burden, a catastrophe, we believe, when things happened, especially to a provider in a small family level group. There were superstitions about, the person being cursed or about having done something wrong, about being possessed in some way by evil spirits, about their condition somehow being contagious and those spirits passing to other members of the clan. There was the need often to break ties with the sick one because they may have to be let go and left to die, especially if we were off migrating across open country and someone was seriously injured or sick. It could be very difficult to take care of them or carry them or move them. And so throughout our evolution, truly, these kinds of things, these diseases and serious injuries and illnesses, infections, were very difficult and evoked a lot of response and emotion that we had very little ability to deal with then. And for most of our entire evolution, we have been at a loss largely to do much about these things. And so that kind of mind state of regarding these things has developed over these tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of years into responses that we have when we are faced with somebody in our lives or ourselves that suddenly have a serious illness. I remember when I would tell somebody about my wife or about myself and our illness, I would be all adjusted with it, and I would tell them, and their eyes would flare open wide, and they'd be, "Oh my God!" And their response was physical. And really nothing was happening at the time. They're in a completely different place and feeling something that doesn't exist. Their imaginations and deep feelings and emotions are, I think, coming from all this history that I would just say, yes, here's what's happening, but they're very excited and very agitated and concerned. So that's just an example of really what can happen. So we have these kind of primordial emotions that can trigger us. Further complicating it, we have how our parents responded and when we were children, hearing and listening and learning to these verbal cues and nonverbal cues of things they did and said. For example, my mother, upon hearing somebody, in the family, a relative who got very sick, I remember she was on the phone and her voice is tense and she's, "Oh my God, that's terrible, and I can't believe this." She was, her eyes open wide, she was deadly serious in her tone, and nothing had happened to this person. Of course, eventually they did die, but I learned right off the bat, as I think many people do, that you get news like this and you respond in a certain way. So we have our parents, adding to some of this emotional baggage that we carry from our evolution. We have medical dramas that we've seen hundreds, even thousands of scenes of people in hospitals and doctors' offices getting the news of some illness or something that is going on, and it's very dramatic and it's very sad often, and it's certainly emotional no matter what, and there's prognoses out there and all kinds of things that we're conditioned, again, from childhood watching these kinds of things. We have past relatives, 1 or 2 or 3, whatever it might be, who had some illness, and they are very firmly in our minds. I know my mother, who had cancer, was someone that I experienced that through, and so when I would hear, my wife got cancer, I'm thinking of my mother, and how she went through chemo and vomiting and diarrhea and pain and misery and kind of secluding herself, having someone in there helping, and that was the 80s. So it's very different now, but we don't have that ability just to turn that off. So we often think about these past relatives and what they went through and instantly associate it to ourselves or to this loved one that we may be caring for or hearing about. We've got illness statistics. So when we do hear about these kinds of things, there's all kinds of survival statistics, and if we ask, which I typically recommend thinking very hard about and not asking for a prognosis, but we get these statistics that give life expectancies. Lots of issues with those statistics in how inaccurate they can be and how potentially destructive, in my opinion, they can be to someone who has an illness and those around them. Much more on that in the book, but I'll leave it at that. So you've got these evolutionary things. You've got past relatives, you've got medical dramas, you've got statistics and parents. All of this kind of mishmash creates a screen that we see the sick one through, and as a sick one we see ourselves through, that is not really who they are. It is based on all these things which aren't the sick one. And that is a stereotype, and that is a form of prejudice. When we don't see someone individually, but we place them in this category of someone sick, and here's what this means. And it's a catastrophe, and it's all these things that we've been taught and have observed are the case with sickness and believed to be the case. But they're not for this particular person. Yes, some things may coincidentally turn out to be, but in my case, 95% of the assumptions I made about myself and about my wife were not true. We are predicting into the future when we do that, and we have no idea what we're talking about, and simply make ourselves very nervous and distressed, which I'll talk about in a moment. So these emotions are things that are very strong. Usually we don't even question them. They're beneath the surface. It's like, well, the person has got cancer, or the person has a serious issue of some kind, and well, of course, we're all keyed up. But that shouldn't necessarily be the case. It should not, because we don't know what's going to happen. To be keyed up and to be nervous and to be anxious and all the things that come with that, we have to really predict into the future that this could go very badly, that they could be in a lot of pain and have a lot of problems. Otherwise, we wouldn't feel that way. So it's more than just an idea when we hear that someone gets sick. It's a biological and neurological feeling and response that we have in us. That makes it different than hearing, someone's getting a divorce, or that a job is lost, or that finances have been lost, or other kinds of major things that happen in our lives. Because of this long evolution with sickness and injury and disease, we have some very different kinds of responses that actually we feel in our bodies. That feeling is something that you have probably felt when you've heard someone who gets this illness, gets some illness. And certainly I felt very strongly and over many evenings, grappled with regarding my wife's illness in particular when it was new to me. This is at the heart of this sick prejudice, and it can really be a problem for a variety of reasons. So what happens is that for our friends and families, they can interpret all this as just, baseline fear. They can feel like something bad could happen to them in this illness situation if they get very involved with you as the sick person, or it was with me, or whatever. And certainly in the early times when my mother was sick, I would have these feelings when she was had Alzheimer's and worked through that. But this is something that comes up. We have this fear. It could be a burden. I'll talk more about this later. I may not be able to handle it. I don't have time. All kinds of things. We'll talk about that. But why is this really bad is because there's a study that talks about 148 different studies. It's called a meta-analysis, and it involved over 308,000 participants. And why this issue is bad comes out very well in this research. It's called Social Relationships and Mortality Risk, Meta-Analytic Review. It concluded, in part, that people with stronger social relationships, that is, having the support of family and friends, had a 50% increased likelihood of survival than those with weaker social relationships. So that's massive. Further, the study concluded that these findings indicate that the influence of social relationships on the risk of death is comparable with well-established risk factors such as smoking and alcohol consumption on mortality, and that these social relationships are a greater influence than things such as physical inactivity and obesity. So what does this mean? It means that when there is not the social support, when friends and family do pull away and drop off, that it is a major issue. It is of a caliber of smoking and, high alcohol consumption, and that, you're better off being obese and inactive rather than not having the support of friends and family. So that's a big study, 308,000 people and 148 different combined studies pulling in all kinds of information and analyzing all these different studies. So that's why this issue of a sick prejudice, this problem of people scaring themselves out of being involved in the situation, is so important for the sick one. And I'll talk in a moment about how important it is for the friends and family and what they lose as well. So what happens is that this kind of pulling away, this avoidance, this kind of aversion feeling can come out in the form of some excuses, just to give you a feel for that. So one is like this, and I'll go through some of these, that, so-and-so had a horrible illness like this and then died. It was awful. So in this excuse, the person is starting to think about someone else they've known, and they are applying it to this person who has breast cancer now, and their mother who had breast cancer, or a friend, or whatever, and suggesting that it's going to be the same. That then can be a very frightening thing for the friend or family member who is automatically projecting this same kind of expectation on a person newly diagnosed with breast cancer. Second, they may look at statistics and say, I read they only have a 20% chance of beating this. It's so sad. So now they're already into statistics, they're already believing the statistics, they're already assuming that this sick one has this 20% chance that they're going to die, and what that can do is it can cause a friend or family member to want to pull away, to start to break emotional ties, just like they did over millions of years of our evolution, where, okay, we have to not get attached to this person because they're going to die, and it can just, suck out resources, time, and emotional energy from us. That, again, I'll talk about in a moment, is no longer the case. That was a long time ago, even though it lasted for an incredibly long time in our evolution. But we will make those kinds of assumptions when we see these statistics. I talk about that at length in my book and some of the problems with these statistics. Another one is, I'd like to help, but if I start, will I get asked to do more than I want? Will they get sucked in? Will they have lose control? And there's a fear of that they just won't be able to say no, and they will feel sorry and start doing more than they're comfortable doing. I talk about that in the book also, but that's an important one where people feel like they may not have control. I think once they do get involved, and I talk about this in the book, they do have that control. But these kinds of excuses and fears and questions come up before typically they're involved, and they are assuming certain things. Here's another one. Oh God, what if they ask for money? So this is another fear of just it being a burden, of not being able to afford it, of not being able to say no if they do ask for money, and just that coming up. Another one. Now that I think about it, I don't even have a very close relationship with this sick person, with you, or it was with me, or whatever. And And so here's this cutting ties type of thing where all of a sudden it's like, oh, gee, I question the relationship now that it's, something significant has happened in it, and I'm really looking for ways to avoid getting involved. So, gee, they're seriously ill. We were just, casual acquaintances. I don't really need to get involved, and they must have friends or family, and we're just not very close. It's not really something that I need to be a part of. Another one, they probably brought this on themselves by always doing such and such. And that's one where we look to blame the illness on something the sick one did, so that we can kind of remove ourselves from responsibility for helping. Since the person supposedly caused it themselves, then they're responsible and we're not. And that often comes out. So I will say here, and talk about it more in the book, that really people are not responsible for their illness, even if they smoked and drank, that there's reasons that they did those things that go back into their history. And ultimately, someone who's sick simply needs some help, and we don't need to question, why they got sick and start looking at reasons for not helping like that. Another one, they must have someone else who can help, someone not as busy as I am. So these kinds of things come up. I'll let it go there. The book spends a lot of time on these kinds of things that come up. What's important is, as I was saying before, that when we make these kinds of excuses, have these kinds of questions, try to get out of it, we miss a great deal ourselves as potential helpers. And some of that, very briefly, is we were meant to help. So again, you go back into our evolution, and throughout this time we would have been in these small family level groups. We would have had sick ones there, elderly ones there, injured there, and as we're walking around doing things, we would have just gotten them something. We would have helped them build their fire. We would have brought them some food. We would have fed them, and just taken turns. It would have just happened naturally. As child walked by, they would have helped, and as an older person walked by or whatever, people would have just been cooperating. It would have been a fundamental part of kind of our socialization together, would be assisting in this way. Similar to taking care of newborn children and watching over toddlers. These kinds of things give meaning to our lives, and they're things we're supposed to do. Like a good craft or career gives us meaning. So I believe that there's a great deal of meaning, of satisfaction that we get when we do help someone who's injured and sick. That is something that we miss and is a loss to our lives. Again, talk about that quite a bit in the book, all the different things that we can lose. But that's a major issue when we lose that depth of understanding of life and the value of life, and how important it is for us to be a part of this, to see it unfold as someone's ill and perhaps dies, as they get better, to be a part of that. These kinds of things are crucial to our own development and to our own handling of when we get sick. It's important to have seen that, to have gone through that, and to have assisted with that, so that we feel this connection. So I think, as we start to close here, what can be done for this situation as a sick one, if you're watching this, is first, give the friends and family things to do. So they're going to be reluctant, they're going to think they shouldn't get involved, or they don't want to butt in, and these kinds of things. Get them involved, ideally with things that they can enjoy doing once a week, twice a week, once or twice a month, whatever it might be. That will help them to see that their involvement isn't all the exaggerated things that they think it can be and mean. Then, second is talk to them about how they feel, whether they're feeling, fear and burden and like this is a catastrophe, it's dreadful, suffering. Try to get at that. I know you're the sick one and really want to know, and typically it's about you, but so much is going to hinge on these people in your life that it's important to really know how they feel so that you can keep them in the present moment, so that you can say, gosh, I hear that you're out here in the future. Boy, I'm just here sitting in my recliner right now and nothing really is happening. So let's not be in catastrophe, dread-filled minds, and let's not think about suffering and let's not think about these kinds of things. Let's just focus on some good things that can happen, and right now we're just taking care of some chores around the house type of thing. Really try to keep them focused in the now and and in touch with their feelings. So again, another thing that typically is reserved for the sick one, you, is reassure these friends and family members that it won't be like they imagine. So I think we're safe to say that whatever they're imagining, it's not going to be like that. That is very important. So let them know it's going to be okay, that we'll work through this. We're just going to take it, 1 hour, one day at a time, make some plans as we go for how to accomplish some things around the house, to get to doctor's visits, to plan some meals and things. But it's going to work out, and give them some reassurance, because they're way above reality most of the time, and into a very pessimistic zone, and a zone where they feel like things may not work out, because historically that was the case quite a bit. Now it is different. Now we have homes, and we have food and resources and water, and we're not in immediate danger of losing livelihoods and things like that, like we were for millions of years when these kinds of things happen. But we're still attuned to those kinds of feelings. We also have incredible medical technologies and techniques and methods and drugs that have come online even just in the last 5 and 10 years that make much of this illness a new ballgame. So even thinking back to people 10 years, 20 years, 30 years ago who may have had some similar illnesses, today is a very different day. Not to mention this person is a completely different person. You, the doctors, the medicines, the time. So that's important for them to remember. Suggest they read this Sick Prejudice book. Stay in the moment yourself. That's important for everybody, and perhaps the most important thing, which I've talked about on some other videos as well. So lastly, as a sick one, just quickly I would say experience this journey fully and all that it reveals to you. It's priceless. The pain that there may be, the uncertainty, the new perspective on the world, the deeper understanding of life are all wonderful gifts to have, and hopefully you can share that with your friends and family, and that they can be a part of this process to understand life in a much more meaningful and close, warm way. This is certainly the way I have come to appreciate the illness my wife had and my own. Even though I'm doing exceptionally well, I look back and can say, wow, look at all the wonderful gifts I got from this. In many ways was one of the best things that ever happened to me, getting cancer. And so I encourage you to have a perspective that looks for the good in this. Don't mean that to sound sappy, and don't mean that to sound overly optimistic, but it is there. I encourage you to look for it and to enjoy it as best you can. Thank you very much. If you have questions, comments, go right to my website, josephmcnulty.com. Thank you for watching.